All right, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today with Unix Linux security expert and managing consultant at CyberEdge Group, Karen Scarfone, a guide to replacing sudo and simplifying Unix and Linux privilege management. It's going to be a good one today, you guys. We're also joined by Beyond Trust product manager Paul Harper, who will run us through a Beyond Trust overview and demo of PowerBroker for Unix Linux towards the end of the webinar, so I encourage you to please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today, and just a kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box. You should find that on the side of your screen in the GoToMeeting console, and go ahead and submit your questions anytime throughout the webinar, and I will be monitoring those throughout, and then we'll cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 business day from now. So you should receive them by Friday. So at this point, I'd like to hand it on over to Karen, who will start her presentation and jump right in. Hey, Karen, welcome to the line, and thanks for being here today.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me. Welcome to all of you who are watching this webinar today. I'm going to be talking to you about the need to be replacing sudo or sudo, as you might want to pronounce it, and simplifying your organization's Unix and Linux privilege management. So before I get into the meat of the presentation, I want to just sort of set the stage for who this webinar is for. So really anyone who has any sorts of responsibilities related to securing the Unix and Linux servers and especially user accounts in your organization, this is the webinar for you. We're not going to get into a real deep technical detail. We're not going to get into certain flavors of Unix or Linux. The information that you'll get from this webinar will apply to your organization, period. Doesn't matter what type of Unix and Linux servers you have. This webinar will be more beneficial to people from organizations that have lots and lots of Unix and Linux server accounts with privileges. Whether that means you have a lot of accounts on a smaller number of servers or a smaller number of accounts on a larger number of servers. You also really need this webinar if you are in an organization that's being threatened by attackers exploiting these accounts. And nowadays, that ends up being just about everybody. Attackers are really focused on getting access to these accounts and using them to work their way through your organization, often undetected. And they're aware that these accounts aren't often on the radar. So, and especially if your organization is using an older traditional sudo-based privilege management usually these are sort of homegrown solutions. They just don't scale for enterprise-wide use. And I'm going to give you more information on that in just a few more slides. So who am I? Why should you be listening to me? That's always a good question. So I've actually been a Unix user since way back in 1989. For a few years, I was actually a sysadmin for a set of Unix and Linux systems, Red Hat boxes, and OpenBSD. I was also, back in the day, a SANS Institute certified Unix security administrator. So I know all the fundamentals of Unix security. I've been out of the hands-on world for a while now. I specialize in security publication development. So I'm just telling you that to say I'm not here, again, to tell you about the syntax of a particular command or how to do something in a certain shell or a certain Linux distribution. I'm here to educate you on the advances in managing privileges on Unix and Linux systems, techniques and technologies for doing that. So in this webinar, I'm again first going to talk to you about why traditional sudo-based privilege management approaches are no longer sufficient to meet your organization's security needs or its security compliance needs. Next, I'm going to explain at a high level what a Unix and Linux server privilege management platform is and how it works. Again, not in the deep details, but I'm going to give you enough information that you understand what's going on behind the scenes. What's the magic that makes all of this work? Which to me personally is the most interesting part of it. I think it's a really clever way that these platforms sort of do all the hard work and the manual work behind the scenes and really make life a lot easier, not only for the administrators, but also for the privileged users. And then the rest of this webinar, I'm going to talk about the different types of benefits that your organization can get from a privilege management platform. This is going to include limiting who has access to your privileged accounts on these servers, how the platform can help your organization achieve compliance with HIPAA and SOX and many other security compliance initiatives, how a platform can actually help reduce your organization's risk of compromise, and finally, how this platform can help you avoid negatively impacting your organization's productivity as you tighten and monitor all these privileges. There are a lot of risks posed by privileged Unix and Linux accounts. I mean, as you know, they're absolutely necessary. You have to have an account with those administrator rights to do all sorts of different things. From one-time tasks to daily operations and maintenance. So these privileged Unix and Linux accounts can't simply be eliminated. You have to have them. The problem is that in most cases, each one of these accounts is incredibly powerful. It has sweeping, often complete privileges on each server where that account resides. And a single account may have privileges across many servers. So, you have a single user account that if that gets compromised, if an attacker gets a password, or otherwise gets credentials, that attacker can then do all sorts of things in your environment with that privileged account. And the attacks that we see a lot anymore are pivot attacks. So an attacker comes into your organization on any server. It could be a very innocuous, low priority server that you would never think an attacker would target. And then they go to that server, they get a privileged account. They can then maybe use that privileged account to get access to another server, or to get access to other privileged accounts and get access to lots of other servers. And by doing this over and over, they can hop through your enterprise from server to server and eventually get to whatever their ultimate target is. Maybe it's financial records, credit card information, maybe it's medical records, maybe it's your organization's intellectual property. And once stolen, you can't recover from that loss. So, the attackers know that these accounts are out there, and they know that these accounts are often not closely monitored or audited, in part because they're often shared. And I'll get into that a little more later. But if you think about it, if you have many people who share an account, how do you know which one of them is doing any particular thing at any given time? You also have the insider threat problem. You might have a malicious, privileged insider. You could have somebody who has legitimate access to one of these accounts, and they're disgruntled with your organization, or they need to get their hands on some extra money, and they're willing to steal information or do other damage for their own benefit or own reasons. So really, the privileged Unix and Linux accounts have sort of a wide range of risks associated with them, and they're very serious risks. In the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about sort of the shortcomings of what most organizations are doing today, through no fault of their own. When we had a small number of servers and a small number of administrators using sudo or sudo, to manage those privileges. It made a lot of sense. It was simple, it was light, it was easy, it was a good solution. As organizations have added more servers and more administrators, it's become a real problem. Sudo is just simply not designed for enterprise-wide use. There's a great deal of complexity in using it because you have to implement and manage it locally on each server. So it's not a centralized thing, and it's also it can be very challenging to set it up and to maintain it. The policy language and format that's used for sudo is pretty hard to read and use. I have a quote on the slide here from an IT consultant. He talked about the configuration of sudo, the configuration file. He said that the man page for it is just, it's awful, poorly explained, obfuscated. It's not that sudo is impossible to use. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if someone is a novice to Unix and Linux administration and security, it's going to be challenging. And you don't want this to be challenging. You want the people who are setting up, implementing, managing, maintaining your sudo configuration to be Unix and Linux security experts. Because if there's a mistake made in this configuration, there could be really dire consequences. External attackers or malicious insiders could easily exploit a mistake or something that's been overlooked in the sudo configuration, and all of a sudden they're able to do all sorts of things that you would have no idea they could do. So it's tricky though, because you'd like to have your security, your Unix and Linux security experts doing this work, but as I'm sure you know, they're scarce. There's not a lot of these folks around. Frankly, they're going to be pretty costly. And probably the last thing they're going to want to do is spend all their time going from server to server managing sudo. So, ideally you'd like to have more junior people doing some of this work, but they're probably, they're going to be more likely to make mistakes. It's a tough situation. There's not a really good way around this issue. And that's just one of the shortcomings. The second shortcoming of the traditional method is that, it really relies heavily on syslog for auditing and logging. Syslog has a lot of really great purposes. This is probably not one of them. With privilege management, you really want to log a lot of information about privilege use. And with syslog, you're going to be very limited in how much of that detail you can record. So without a more robust logging mechanism, you're going to be losing out on a lot of that traceability and accountability, and you're not going to have the types of documentation and evidence that you would need to demonstrate compliance with a lot of security initiatives. You don't have the information that you need to really know what's being done by whom, where, and when. Here's a few more reasons why sudo is just not really making the grade anymore. Probably the most compelling reason to me, besides the manpower issues, is that with sudo, each privileged account is typically going to get far more power, far more privileges than the individuals really need. You have, say, 20 people sharing access to a privileged account. And not all of those 20 people are performing the same sorts of duties. Some people maybe need the whole range of privileges, while others actually just need one or a few. And under a sudo model, it gets difficult to manage that. So what you tend to do is you have one account on the system. Everybody has access to that account through sudo. And so that account has all these privileges that most of the people don't really need. What that means in terms of compromise is that a malicious insider or an external attacker can do a great deal of harm just accessing that single account. The problem is that sudo just doesn't offer the granularity and flexibility in defining privileges that most organizations require today. For example, with sudo, you can't achieve fundamental security principles like least privilege and separation of duties. You just can't get to those things where each individual person is only receiving the privileges that they need, and that you don't have someone with, the wide range of privileges that they can sort of circumvent separation of duties and, approve their own requests and things like that to circumvent your security policies. So with sudo, you can't get to there. And, I don't care if it's HIPAA, SOX, FISMA, PCI DSS, all of those compliance initiatives are going to require least privilege, and they're going to require separation of duties. So that alone is a major strike against trying to manage your privileges with sudo. Another issue is with sudo, you have pretty limited visibility into and control over the system. One example is you can't really restrict access to the file system. So if I'm giving you privileged access to the file system, you have access to everything. It's not restricting you to a certain part of the file system or saying that a particular part is out of bounds. More disturbing is that it can't track which commands a script is executing. So if you had an external attacker or a malicious insider on your system or malware provided by an attacker, and that malware, or that person is executing a script, sudo will record that the script ran with privileges, but it won't necessarily record what commands were run from that script. And not having that visibility and control over the system is a major problem as well. Again, with traceability, accountability, and having evidence and understanding what an attacker has done to your system so that you can recover more quickly. A final item that I want to talk about a little bit is credential management. Really, this approach, as some of you probably know from your own experience, can make credential management across servers a nightmare. Suppose that you have a sysadmin named Bob, and Bob has to help manage and maintain 100 servers. So if you could give Bob his own credentials, let's say, do you set the same password on all 100? Then all somebody has to do is just guess one or steal one, and they can access all 100 servers. Do you set a different password for each of the 100? Now Bob has to manage 100 passwords. He has to store them somewhere. He has to rotate them on a regular basis. It's again just not scalable. It's just fundamentally not a scalable approach. So the solution that's come up built up over the last several years, but really starting to be, widely seen, at least in the folks that I talk to, are Unix and Linux server privilege management platforms. So that's a long way of saying that we have a system that's an enterprise-wide solution for managing and using privilege on your Unix and Linux servers. The heart of this solution is a set of authorization servers, and they handle all requests to use privileges on behalf of the people. So they take a user's verified identity and they match that against a set of granular policies that are configured on the privilege management platform. And those policies specify the privileged use authorized for each user on each server. Now, I'll talk more about that granularity in a few minutes, but it can be a highly granular approach. So in essence, the user is not authenticating to the Unix and Linux servers. The user is authenticating to or being authenticated by the privilege management platform. The privilege management, the user is basically forced through that platform. And the platform then acts on behalf of them if they meet all the requirements that are defined in the platform. So the users themselves have no knowledge of or access to the credentials on each of those servers. So instead of having to know your 100 passwords, now Bob just has to authenticate to the platform. And the platform takes care of managing behind the scenes all of his access to all of those servers. So Bob doesn't necessarily, Bob just has one credential now. Bob doesn't have 100 credentials. And so this allows the platform to make sure that Bob, can't authenticate to those systems anymore, controls everything that he does, because everything is forced through the platform. So all his privileged use has to go through there, which allows centralized management and monitoring of that use. So the platform is really a way of regaining control over all your privilege management and use. Have everything in one place and really helping to take away headaches from your administrators and from your users. So in a nutshell, the goal of a privilege management platform is to limit who has access to privileged accounts in order to achieve compliance and reduce the risk of compromise without negatively impacting productivity. And that's a mouthful, but the 4 bullets below it explain the 4 objectives that make up that goal. So again, we want to limit who can access the privileged accounts on our servers. We want to make sure that we comply with all the security initiatives that we're subject to. We want to reduce the risk that our organization is going to be compromised through these servers, or that the servers themselves will be compromised. And we want to make sure that by doing all this, we're not hurting our organization's productivity. Now I'm going to talk through each of the 4 of those in more detail. First is limiting access to privileged accounts. And one of the huge benefits of a privilege management platform is that it can minimize or even in some cases completely eliminate the need to have shared privileged accounts. And this is a huge deal when it comes to accountability and traceability. You can now assign each user a unique account. They use that unique account to authenticate to the platform. They're no longer authenticating as a root user or an admin user or another generic shared account. So now you have full traceability as to who is accessing, who's accessing each account or who's authorized to access that account. And you can see what actions they're performing with that account on each server that they have privileges on. Now, the platform can support special cases where shared accounts are still needed. There are cases where you have perhaps some sort of appliance device or other system that just can't, for various reasons, you just can't take away that shared account. It's built into software, whatever the case, it's an exception. So if you have an exception like that, it's okay. You can still use that with the platform, and the platform will do all that shared account behind the scenes. But to you, it will appear like you're logging in individually. So you still get that accountability and auditing. A privilege management platform generally gives you 2 types of authentication options. One is that the platform itself can support authentication. And because these are privileged accounts, you always want to be using strong authentication, in most cases multi-factor authentication. A hidden benefit of this that isn't necessarily obvious right away is that if you add multi-factor authentication at the platform level, then you don't have to add it for privileged use on each of those individual servers. So instead of making your 500 Unix and Linux servers each support multi-factor authentication, you can just add it at the platform level. and then you do not have to worry about that all being done behind the scenes. You can have other strong authentication mechanisms behind the scenes for the platform to be communicating with these individual servers, but that's a far, far simpler task than trying to deploy multi-factor auth throughout all of your servers for privileged use. We also, the platforms can also support using existing enterprise authentication services. You know, it may be in your environment that you already have multi-factor auth. It may be that you just can't deal with creating and maintaining yet another set of identifiers and credentials for your administrators. You know, it may be that you already have such a good authentication system set up that's so strong that you just want to use it, or it's just far more convenient, or you know, there are many different reasons. But these privilege management platforms allow that as well. So you can just easily, you know, connect one of these platforms to your existing Active Directory structure or anything else, and it will you know, bring all that over so you don't have to manage yet another set of credentials. So another thing to think about is compliance. And nobody likes to think about compliance, but it's one of those sorts of necessary evils that pretty much everybody has to deal with anymore. Most organizations, even small, fairly small organizations, are subject to one or more security compliance initiatives, sometimes several, ranging from HIPAA, PCI, SOX, GLBA, FISMA, ISO 27000, and dozens or hundreds more. You know, many for localities around the world, other international standards, many industry-specific standards. There's all sorts of initiatives out there that we're all faced with dealing with now. And although that sounds really overwhelming, and it certainly can be in a lot of ways, one thing about these initiatives is that they tend to require the same things when it comes to privilege management. They require organizations to know at all times who is accessing their sensitive systems and data and what they're accessing. They require that organizations monitor, log, and audit all of that activity. And they also require the ability to generate reports on an as-needed basis that provide evidence, documented evidence, that the organization is complying with the requirements. So you can really, by focusing on that second one, you know, they're all important, but robust monitoring, logging, and auditing is particularly important because it really helps to cover the other two. If you're recording all the right information, then you already know the first one, who's accessing your systems and data. And if you have all those thorough logs, then you can easily generate reports from them that provide all the evidence you need. So the real key to me is that monitoring, logging, and auditing piece. And it's particularly important that it captures who is using privileged access on a server at any given time. Really in as much detail as you can log. So what was the user ID? What server were they acting on? What time did it start? What time did the session end? What host were they coming from? What IP address? All the details that you can. And then for each of those privileged sessions, which commands or other actions did that person perform? And again, you want to try to capture as much detail as is feasible. So for example, you want to know the sequence of those commands. You want a timestamp for each one of those commands. Again, whatever kind of information you need to be able to go back and say that you understand the sequence of events and that you can demonstrate that there was no inappropriate access, say, to credit card data. So it's another thing that a privilege management platform is really valuable for is actually helping to reduce the risk of compromise within your organization. And this includes not only your Unix and Linux servers, but other servers as well. Because as we talked about before, this can sort of be the stepping stone into an organization to attack other systems. Now, I always have to caveat, we all know there's no security control or combination of security controls that can completely eliminate the risk of compromise. There is no such thing. But certainly it's clear that proper use of a privileged management platform can definitely help reduce risk. And there's several ways that this happens. First, and simplest, you can specify privileges with a high degree of granularity. So some of the examples I gave before, I was talking about saying like who can do what from where. So really you can restrict on a per command basis, per server basis, per user basis. You can restrict by day of the week, date, time of the day, source IP or host name, destination IP or host name. There's all sorts of options available to you in establishing the policies that are used by privilege management platforms. So this granularity gives you all sorts of control and restrictions as to what happens. And this is really valuable in enabling people to have truly just the privileges that they need. But it's also very valuable to help reduce the risk of compromise. So with this level of granularity, if you have somebody that only needs access during regular business hours, and they are only coming from a particular department subnet, and they only need to access a certain group of files and use 3 commands on those files, hey, you can actually set that level of granularity. You can make everything incredibly specific. And while that takes some work, the result is that if that account is compromised, there's not much the attacker can do with it. The stricter you are, the less chance there is of that account being compromised in the first place or being used to expand and to continue an attack. Maybe you have somebody who has an account and all they do is use it to, access audit reports or run audit reports. Yes, there may be some value in that for your attacker, but odds are that's really not what they're looking for. So it can definitely be a deterrent, and if nothing else, really slow attackers down and force them to work much harder to try to find a good target and a good way in, which may be enough to deter them into going and looking at someone else instead of you. We also have reducing the risk of compromise by use of role-based access control. And so in case you're not really familiar with role-based access control, in a nutshell, it involves, instead of manually assigning privileges for each user, what you're doing is you are creating a set of roles. You set the privileges for each role, and then you map users to those roles. So you might have a sysadmin role. You might have a backup administrator role. You could have several different roles on your systems, and by doing role-based access control, you actually save yourself a lot of time because you don't have to issue the same privileges over and over. I know I worked for a Fortune 500 company many years ago, and this was before the systems we had supported role-based access control. And the conventional wisdom then was, well, you find out who somebody's teammates are, and you just copy all the privileges over to them. And that really doesn't work very well. You end up with all sorts of stray privileges. People change roles, and the privileges don't get cleaned out. And over time, the privileges just sort of grow and grow, and people have privileges that they really no longer need. It's a real maintenance nightmare. So using role-based access control is a big help. Another way of reducing the risk of compromise is to restrict and monitor access and changes to system files, directories, other objects on a system. But basically, instead of just having privilege management in terms of system privileges, you're also able to specify granular privileges for files and directories and other such objects. So it's not just that you can set privileges for an individual command. Now you can also tie in, restricting access to the file system and other objects. So that can also limit the range that an attacker may have to try to, more widely compromise the system or to jump to other systems. And finally, the last item under reducing risk of compromise, you're able with this platform to do constant monitoring and analysis of all log entries. Now this, can refer to a person sitting at a console monitoring log entries, but the privilege management platforms themselves can do the analysis on behalf of people. So instead of having to have people sitting and looking at these screens 24 hours a day, now you can have the systems, the platform actually monitoring all the activity across these systems. It can detect brute force attacks. It can detect somebody trying to directly authenticate to a server when there should be no direct authentication permitted for those privileged users. It can identify all sorts of suspicious activity related to privileged access. Maybe it just finds an administrator who keeps trying to run commands that they're not authorized to run, which again could indicate an insider attack, or it could indicate that that account has been compromised and an attacker is trying to do something with it. Now it could also indicate that someone's job responsibilities have changed, or they're in the wrong console, or there are certainly a lot of innocent explanations as well. But when it comes to privileged access, you want to be erring on the side of caution. You don't want to just assume that it's okay, and you really need to be paying a lot more attention when something is happening that's unusual. And this arrangement, this platform, gives you a way to find those a lot more quickly and get the right people involved to investigate what's happening and figure out what sort of intervention may be needed, if anything. A final important thing about privilege management platforms is they actually not only don't negatively impact productivity, they can actually help improve it. So now when you think about tightening privileged access, I was talking before about all these different options available to really lock down and restrict what privileged users can do. You can certainly see where that could be carried too far. So if I take a user, a privileged user, and give them basically no privileges at all, maybe they have to then call me the next day and say, I can't do this task, I can't do this work, I need more privileges. So then you give them just a little bit more. And then you find out a few days later that they need to work at 7 p.m. and you only gave them authority to work till 5 p.m. And if you try to be overly strict, it can really hurt both sides. It can make the privileged user really have to jump through hoops to get their work done. And from the administrative side, you're constantly going in and having to tweak settings and adjust things, and it becomes too much of a burden. So I'm certainly not suggesting that if you try to use a privilege management platform in that way, yes, you are going to negatively impact productivity. The idea is to strike that balance, to do your own sort of risk assessment as to what's appropriate, and then to set all the privileges accordingly. By doing that, the platform can really improve the efficiency for administrators, privileged administrators, because you have that true centralized administration. Also gives you the ability to delegate routine tasks. So, if an admin is currently doing things like password resets, because they don't want to give a help desk agent full access to a server to reset passwords on it, now they're able to create new accounts for those individual help desk agents, give them just the privileges that they need to do that task, and now the admins don't have to do those routine tasks anymore. So you can actually have your senior, more highly paid staff doing more strategic tasks and hand off the sort of operational work to other people to perform. Also, improve the efficiency of privilege use itself. The example I had earlier about Bob with 100 passwords, Bob doesn't have 100 passwords anymore. Now Bob has one. If Bob is authenticated by the platform, and now he can use his privileges on all the servers he's authorized to without having to re-authenticate to every server. It's basically handling all this stuff behind the scenes so that Bob and all these other people who need to use the privileges don't have to worry about it. So, it can really be a great benefit, especially in organizations with a lot of Unix and Linux servers, to really reduce the burden while also increasing security. So to summarize quickly, the traditional sudo-based approaches for managing Unix and Linux privileges are just not sufficient today to counter today's threats, meet security compliance requirements, and just keep up with the scale and the scope of this problem today. If you get a Unix and Linux server privilege management platform for your environment, you can really limit who's accessing those accounts. You can achieve compliance with all the different security initiatives you're subject to, reduce the risk to compromise, and not negatively impact your organization's productivity. These platforms really eliminate or nearly eliminate using shared accounts. They support strong authentication. They provide really strong, robust monitoring, logging, and auditing capabilities. They enable enforcing highly granular policies for privileges, both in terms of commands being issued and files, directories, and other objects. And in many cases, using these platforms can actually increase productivity in your enterprise. Well, that's it for my portion of the presentation. Right now, I'm going to hand it off to Paul. And Paul's from Beyond Trust, and he's going to present one of their solutions for privilege management platforms.
Okay, thanks very much, Karen. Okay, so yeah, we're just gonna dive right into I guess the stuff that I'm going to cover. And let's get off the title slide and get into something a little bit more meaningful. So effectively, what I'm going to talk about today is what I'm responsible for here at Beyond Trust, which is in that privilege management bucket, and that's really privilege management around Unix and Linux platforms. So I'm personally responsible for our PowerBroker for sudo product and PowerBroker for Unix and Linux. Which essentially what those solutions do is help you solve the challenges or implement the controls that Karen covered during her presentation. Now, obviously, we don't have the time, and it's probably not the appropriate setting to go through all of the ways in which we help there. So, we're going to spend 5 or 10 minutes today just just looking ever so slightly into some of the things that we do there, how we actually help bring value into or really help you solve some of those issues, and what it looks like from a well, we'll probably focus on the end user perspective more than anything. Just in case you're not aware, Beyond Trust does do obviously a lot more than this. They cover things like credential management, vulnerability management, bridging to things like Active Directory or management of policy from single locations, auditing of privileged activity, obviously, but also administration as well. Again, we're not going to cover all of that, but just be aware that when you're talking about privilege management in general, there really is a bigger picture to be aware of, other than what we're kind of laser focused today on just looking at the the Unix and Linux side. So PowerBroker for Unix and Linux, real high level. If you read this slide, for the most part, reads kind of a little bit like sudo. Same. We obviously have the same goal. We want to eliminate the sharing of privileged credentials, or give people the permissions they need to do their job without giving them excessive permissions, basically. All of the auditing and reporting stuff, to be compliant, you need to record what's going on. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then obviously we start getting into how we really differentiate, which is things like system level controls. I'm going to cover really what that means. Again, I know it's going to be really quick today, but we touch on very slightly what that means here in just a second. And like I've already mentioned, we at Beyond Trust do more than just Unix and Linux. So we integrate with the entire privileged account management platform if you wish, and you can kind of approach these problems in any order you like. So when I'm talking about PowerBroker for Unix and Linux specifically, the big difference between us and a sudo or sudo type solution is we separate the controls from the policy. So basically in sudo land, for the most part, where you type the sudo command to run, that gets executed on the host where the policy sits. Audit data probably goes to syslog, might be local, might go to a centralized syslog server. But the whole management of that audit data and the policy stuff is kind of cumbersome, which again Karen touched on during her presentation. Again, real high level here. This slide really just says, when you make a request from our solution, it goes to separate servers for authorization. Who's allowed to do what and when they can do that, and also the audit data is also stored centrally. So obviously administration becomes easier. Auditing is much easier because everything's centralized out of the box, and it's designed to be easier to manage, easier to do things like audits and reviews and that sort of stuff, as well as providing additional capabilities, additional power, like out-of-the-box reporting, indexing of your sessions for quicker forensics, and tighter controls around what the users can actually do above and beyond what the user types on the command line. So when I talk about that, that's actually a feature inside of PowerBroker Unix and Linux called Advanced Control and Audit. And again, I won't go overly technical into this, but it solves some of those big problems that you have with a sudo type solution, which really just focuses on what the user's typing on the command line. Inside of PowerBroker, what we do is we look at what the system's actually doing. So the processes, the commands that are run, not how they were typed by the user. So that really covers you for things like file system controls. We don't care what the file permissions may be on a file. We can supplement additional controls around those, like choosing who can view files, edit files, delete files, that sort of stuff. Not just files, folders, obviously. Auditing all of that activity, which includes things like if you block a particular executable from running or binary, we don't care how that binary gets called, whether somebody types it at the command line, whether it gets called from inside of a script, whether it's a symlink, even if the binary gets renamed, we still have complete control over that. And like I say, that also means we can audit things like script activity. So I think Karen even cited that as an example early on in her presentation. When somebody runs a script, rather than just seeing that the script was run, we can actually audit all the information inside of, or basically what that script's doing, as well as control functions inside the actual script. And again, for the more technical people on this call, I can actually show what that looks like here in just a second. Again, I've already mentioned that we've got, reporting. There's, a whole bunch of stuff just for being compliant. It's a very important part of privileged account management. I'm not going to dig into this today because, again, that takes a lot of time to go in. But just some screenshots here just to give you a feel for how you can have some nice dashboard reports. You can easily get in and see what people are doing, what's been allowed in your organization, what's been rejected, that sort of stuff. We have a range of different auditing and reporting options depending on what you're looking to do. But again, we don't really have time to dig too deeply into that today. But I did want to spend at least a few minutes, or maybe like 5 minutes or so, giving people a chance to kind of like see what this looks like. So anyone that's actually logged on to a Unix box or done anything with a Unix system in the past knows it's not the most glamorous demo. It's all command line stuff. But again, when we're talking about privileged account management in the Unix Linux space, we just have to understand that what we're really doing there is controlling what people do at the command line. So it is, like I say, unfortunately, a lot of typing and text. So I'll keep this kind of short, but again, just to give people a chance to see what it actually looks like from an end user perspective, or really to really highlight some of the ways in which we can enhance controls over a tool like sudo. So I'm actually just going to jump onto one of my servers. It actually doesn't matter which one. I'm going to pick this one here kind of randomly, and it logs me on automatically using my AD credentials, again part of what Karen covered. So I've got one centralized ID, which then gives me access to the servers that are defined in my list that I can log on to. So as a user, I was logged onto the Windows box as a user called Demo1, and if I try and find out the user on the Unix host that it connected me to, it's that same user, that user Demo1. So again, real high-level stuff here. If somebody wanted to run a command at a higher privilege, for example, the who am I command, they would normally type, prefix it with sudo. For us, it's pb run, so a power broker run. And if I was to request an elevated execution of that who am I command, I'm actually outputting some information here just saying basically it was approved by a different server. I'm logged onto server 2, went to server 1 for a validation. This was the user that's going to elevate to root, the most privileged account on a Unix Linux system, and then that's the output of that command. Basically that's who it executes as. Now again, you would never really want to elevate the who am I command. I can, depending on what my policy is, elevate certain commands. And because it is all driven by policy, if I try and run a command that's not defined in my policy, like the kill command, I basically get a message saying I'm not authorized, and that request is rejected. Now again, while I'm going through all of this, it's all being logged centrally. It's obviously all being checked via a central policy as well. But like I said, you're not really going to do those basic commands, and that's really not a lot more other than the centralized auditing and centralized policy, more than what you'd get with sudo. So some of the things that we do that provide a whole range of greater flexibility would be things like if I was to try and execute a command called getEnt, that's something I've got in my policy that requires group membership. So it actually does a group check. So here it actually says, it's detected that this user belongs to Linux users and domain users because he's an AD user, but I have to belong to the Linux admins group in order to authorize or be able to run this command, which this user obviously doesn't belong to. So I could go and add that user to that group, or switch to a user that does have that group membership. But really just showing that we can do advanced checking like group membership and be very informative back to the user in terms of what we tell them about what's going on. Now, in addition to that, rather than just showing you, hey, I can add myself to that group and be able to run that command, we can do some other cool stuff. So, for example, if you were to use a password vault of some type, for us, we've got a Power Broker password safe. It really doesn't matter. Just for this example, what this will actually do is when the user makes the request, it can actually go again to that central policy server and basically say, I want to run this command. I've actually included the diagnostic output just so you can see what it's really doing under the covers, and it's basically using an API call to go off to a password vault and retrieve a password for a user. In this case, it's the same as root, and it actually then signs me on as the user root on a different host. So the user issues a command, we can actually be very programmatic under the covers on what we're doing. So in this case, retrieving a password, logging me on to another system. So that's just, again, another use case, and I've got quite a few of these. I will just show you one other one that's, I think, kind of cool. So this user maybe is a database administrator. Again, I can say, pb run SQL, and it's actually going to run SQL plus under the covers. But here's a few things that the policy actually provides for this user. So again, it goes to the central server for validation of the request. It's actually going to run the command as user Oracle. It's connecting to a database that's on my Oracle Linux server, and it's going to log me in as the HR user. Now, besides actually making that connection and getting me logged on, it's also going to record all of the activity into a session recording. So everything the user does now is being recorded. Everything I type, including mistakes, all goes to that central log server. It gets indexed for searching later. And like I say, everything the user sees and types is going to be recorded into that file. So if I was to do something like select, my SQL isn't that good. We're going to do select everything from say departments or something, and I can start doing stuff inside this session. Now, because it's a recorded session, so it's an active PowerBroker session, I can see if I try and do like drop, for example, I try to delete a table, I can intercept that request and basically kick me out of my session. So I can look for any type of text or malicious activity that the user might be doing and terminate that session, as well as at this point generate some sort of alert to maybe like syslog or your SIM. Obviously, we do our own alerting as well. If you want to generate an email or whatever, you can do all of that. All right, so let me just show you a couple of other things very quickly. I know we're getting short on time. So if I was to do like a PB run GP update, if I can type this right, this basically requires two-factor authentication. So the two-factor authentication system I'm using basically sends a prompt to my phone, and if I can hit approve quick enough, then the command gets approved. So again, we can build two-factor authentication into our request. That was basically just Duo under the covers. We can also do things like we can integrate with ticketing systems. So if I do a PB run ticket, what this basically does is say, hey, I need a ServiceNow incident number, and I happen to have one to hand, so we'll just do that real quick. And basically it's going to validate that ticket against ServiceNow. Assuming it's a valid ticket and it has the right priority, I think it's got to be a severity 1 type ticket. It then gives me a list of accounts that I can connect to the server with. I'm going to pick root and just say demo. What day is it? Wednesday. And then obviously it tells me, it's going to record my session. It's going to basically give me root level access, I think, on this server, and just asking me to confirm that I'm willing to let the system connect me, and that all of my information is going to be logged, basically. So now I've got a root level session, and why I did that, again, it did all of that interaction with ServiceNow. We'll actually just hop over real quick, and we're just going to look at our open tickets. And I should be near the top here. There we go. So I'll actually just look in ServiceNow at that ticket. It's actually one that I use for my demo, so there's probably a lot of junk in there. But here we can actually see right now, well, the time zone is 3 hours behind because it's Pacific time, but here you can see there was emergency privileged access granted to the user demo 1 on the host that I was connecting from using the ticket for justification. You saw me type in the ticket number. Again, it gave me full root authority, but it includes the comments that the user had to type, and again, it also includes the session log that I could then go back and review at a later date. So that's just a few examples of use cases. Again, we could go on for another couple of hours showing you some of the other capabilities, but just to give you a feel for how a solution like PowerBroker goes beyond what you get with sudo. Like I said, that just gives you a small taste, so you can see some of the things that are actually possible. All right, so on that, I'm actually going to turn back over to Sarah. I think she's got a poll to show you here at the end, just before we run out of time, and see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, let's jump into our last poll. Here at Beyond Trust, we'd love to help you with your privileged access and even your vulnerability management needs. Would you be interested in engaging with one of our security experts further? We would love to talk with you or walk you through a more thorough one-on-one demo. So if you want to be contacted by a security specialist, please select yes. Let's go ahead and jump into some questions. We had some come in, Paul, while you were demoing. Does PowerBroker work with a Linux LDAP server without the use of Windows?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So the solution itself is called PowerBroker for Unix and Linux, and it runs completely standalone on just Unix or just Linux or Unix and Linux. We integrate with additional systems like LDAP servers, Active Directory. You can manage and control policies from there if you want, but no reason why, if you are a pure Unix shop, you can absolutely run PowerBroker for Unix and Linux on just Unix servers.
Paul, is the reporting part included in PowerBroker or a separate product that requires additional license? Is PowerBroker included in Retina CS Suite?
So anyone that has any of the PowerBroker, which is all of our privileged account management solutions, any PowerBroker product, you get a copy of, so Retina CS has been rebranded to Beyond Insight, but it's actually my host name still says Retina CS, right? So you actually get a copy of that for reporting for free. So you can think of Retina CS or Beyond Insight, as it's now called, as like the SIM for Power Broker solutions. So yeah, you get that. All of the reporting stuff that comes with Power Broker Unix and Linux, yes, you get all of that. There's also a whole bunch of other things that you get that we didn't even touch on today, things like file integrity monitoring. There's a deployment console. There's a web GUI for doing policy management. So all of those additional features with Power Broker for Unix and Linux, when you buy the solution, you kind of get everything. There's no upsell, if you like, for additional features.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I know we're over the top of the hour, but one more for you that just came in, Paul. You mentioned RBAC. What about Power Broker's interaction and integration with SE Linux?
So SE Linux becomes slightly redundant because Power Broker for Unix and Linux basically controls what you're allowed to run. So often people that have controlled sessions with Power Broker will normally disable SE Linux on those systems. But we can run alongside it quite happily. If you want to use it for split sessions, you can just run Power Broker unconfined. It does kind of duplicate your effort, right? And SE Linux in itself isn't the easiest thing to administer. So like I say, normally we find people disabling it or not using it in conjunction with Power Broker controlled sessions. But if you want to do double the work, you can absolutely use SE Linux alongside Power Broker Unix Linux as well.
Okay, guys, it is a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. A reminder, I did receive a couple of questions asking about the follow-up email and slides shown here today. And yes, you will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 1 to 2 business days from now. So you should definitely receive it by Friday. It will be sent to the email with which you registered for the webinar. So be on the lookout for that. And it will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. A huge thanks to Karen and Paul today, and to everybody who attended live. Thank you guys so much for being here. We appreciate your time and hope that these sessions are useful and educational for you. So please provide your feedback after the session. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day and your week. Take care, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye-bye.